Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this webinar, which marks the launch of the AFME and Latham & Watkins report on the ESG disclosure landscape for banks and capital markets in Europe. My name is Jacqueline Mills, and I'm Head of Advocacy for AFME, and I'll be moderating the webinar today. We're delighted to host this webinar to present the report. And to get us started, I thought I would just quickly explain the background and the reasons to why we decided to ask Latham & Watkins to partner with us on this project. The speed of development of ESG disclosures has just been tremendous, and there is more to come. So we realized that it was pretty important for our members and industry to have an overview of the landscape as it stands for the moment, to help them understand the full picture, all of the components and their interactions between the various pieces. So the report is designed to help the industry understand the framework, to navigate it, implement it, and to give them ideas for best practices. Of course, beyond providing a guide for the industry, we also realize that it's a very useful tool for the broader public to also have this full picture of the current landscape, and also for policymakers to understand the challenges that industry could be facing in implementing the current framework and also the future developments. And I think today's webinar is pretty timely and pretty topical. I think the need for this understanding is quite clear. It's evidenced by the fact that we have at least 600 registrations for today's webinar, which we think is almost an AFME record. So we're very pleased to have so many people taking part today. As I said, the report was also an opportunity for us to look at the landscape of current disclosure requirements and reflect with our membership on some recommendations for how the future framework could evolve. I think the key points and principles that we've concluded on might sound quite straightforward, but of course they are difficult to implement in practice. But if we are to achieve a successful ESG disclosure landscape, which can facilitate the allocation of capital to transitioning towards a low carbon economy, I think it's very important that these things are kept in mind as the framework developments. There are three main aspects. I think that's the need for corporates, non-financial corporates, to first develop high quality disclosures, which can then be used by financial institutions in their capital allocation decisions. Of course, there is an element of simplification and streamlining, avoiding duplications and inconsistencies across the components of the frameworks as much as possible. And then the third important aspect that we've realized is that there's an international dimension to consider, both because financial institutions can be global and tend to be global, but also because this journey is a global journey, and we will only be able to tackle the transition to a low carbon economy if we tackle this challenge globally. So the program for today's webinar is to start with a brief overview of the report by Nicola Higgs. Nicola Higgs is a partner in L&W's financial services regulatory practice, and her team have been really the authors of the report, done a lot of work for AFME on this. So thank you very much, Nicola, for that. I'll hand over the floor to you in a minute, but just to say that after your presentation of the report, I'm delighted that we're joined by 5 expert panelists from the official sector and industry, and we'll have about a 70-minute discussion with them to unpack the disclosure landscape as it stands for the moment and go into more detail on implementation challenges and the future evolution of the framework. I'll introduce the participants when we start the webinar. Before giving the floor to Nicola, let me just say that we'd welcome questions from the audience. Participants can please submit your questions using the chat function. I'll try and take as many audience questions as we can during the panel, so we'll try and make sure there's plenty of time for that. And without further ado, I'd like to hand over Nicola to please take us through the report. Nicola, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jacqueline, and good morning, everybody. It's wonderful to be in a position to present the latest AFME report titled ESG Disclosures for Banks and Capital Markets in Europe. And before I do that, let me just take the opportunity to thank the industry members of the AFME Sustainable Finance Working Group, in addition to AFME itself and the wider Latham & Watkins team, for their substantial contributions in producing a report that we really believe will be a very helpful resource to financial markets in navigating the roadmap to compliant ESG disclosures. A core component to achieving the hugely ambitious sustainability targets set by governments around the world is the procurement and disclosure of high quality, comparable ESG data. The challenge that the report is trying to solve for is best captured by this quote from ESMA in its advice to the ESA's joint consultation on SFDR. The synergy between different pieces of legislation, in particular ESG-focused initiatives under NFRD, the taxonomy, SFDR, but also adjacent legislation such as the Shareholders' Rights Directive and the consequential amendments we expect to see in the context of UCITS and MiFID, can contribute significantly to enhancing the sustainability in the economy. However, as it stands, neither the timings nor the concepts of these different pieces of legislation are fully synchronised or aligned with one another. And that's a fair statement, and as Jacqueline has already iterated, the EU regulatory framework for ESG disclosure, it's developed at a tremendous pace over the last 5 years, and it's produced several ambitious and interlinking regulations. And such an ambitious set of regulations requires significant resources for in-scope firms to implement. The primary goal of the report is to provide a practical resource for firms to achieve this in the most efficient way. And it does this by producing a detailed inventory of the key elements of the EU regulatory landscape for ESG disclosures, assessed alongside the TCFD standard, which we believe that many of the international bank members of the AFME working group will be paying attention to as part of their international group's work, and also highlighting the interrelated or overlapping initiatives to offer a practical source for implementation efficiencies. And the report also captures the practical recommendation made by AFME and its members for the next phase of policy work by the EU regulators, and so specifically the revised NFRD, the development of more granular ESG disclosures by EU banks and investment firms, and further guidance on the disclosure standards under the EU taxonomy. So in terms of that first objective, to highlight a detailed inventory of the key elements of the EU regulatory landscape for ESG disclosures, this is achieved through the inclusion of a detailed timeline in the report, which serves as a useful roadmap of the core initiatives and breaks them down depending on whether they are focused solely on climate, have a broader environmental objective, or encapsulate the full range of E, S, and G considerations. And the range of implementation dates you can see highlighted on the screen illustrate the size of the implementation task impacting firms. The report then focuses on providing high-level information on what all of the different strands of regulatory initiative are looking to achieve. It covers NFRD, the EU taxonomy, SFDR, the low carbon benchmark reg, and the Prudential Pillar 3 work, and provides an overview in terms of the scope of each of those regulations, their key objectives, and their implementation dates. And it also highlights at macro level the interdependencies between each of the relevant initiatives. So you can see from the slide that both NFRD and the taxonomy, for example, base their frameworks on some of the commonly adopted international principles in the UN Global Compact, the OECD guidelines, the TCFD reporting. And that fundamental bedrock of ESG understanding can be very helpful for global groups to understand. It will also highlight other synergies between the different pieces of regulation bilaterally. So, for example, for those who implemented SFDR this year and they're planning their SFDR Level 2 compliance roadmap currently, it will highlight the areas of the taxonomy which will overlay the disclosure standards of SFDR for Article 8 and Article 9 products. And for those banks who are looking to create Pillar 3 disclosures in relation to ESG risk, both on a qualitative and quantitative basis, it would be important for them to understand where the metrics that they're required to pull in relation to those ESG risk disclosures are aligned with other areas of regulation that they're subject to. So, for example, understanding that the ESG metrics for the prop index business under the low carbon benchmark regulation are aligned with the Pillar 3 metrics. And the report intends to call all of those synergies out to help banks and investment firms with their implementation work. Going to the second objective of providing a deep dive analysis on the various synergies, the report then moves on to run specific assessments on some of the interrelated or overlapping initiatives and to offer a practical source for implementation efficiencies. So again, recognising that TCFD is the most commonly adopted international framework for banks, both those headquartered outside and inside the EU, the report includes a deep dive analysis specifically on climate risk disclosures. It flags the core differences for firms who are seeking to align existing TCFD and NFRD climate disclosures by calling out the differences in those standards on topics such as disclosure location, time horizon, materiality, emissions, and audit. And then it also goes on to explain how those climate disclosures will be supplemented under the EU taxonomy and Pillar 3 in the years ahead. Taking the deep dive analysis a step further, the report also analyses how the EU regulatory framework supplements TCFD across the spectrum of ESG disclosures. And the report takes each of the TCFD pillars of governance, business strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets, and highlights all of the EU regulatory initiatives that also place disclosure requirements on firms in line with those 4 pillars. And so you can see from the example on the current slide, the governance pillar. It tells us that the package of NFRD, Pillar 3, and SFDR all require entity-level governance-related disclosures, not solely in relation to climate risk, as TCFD does, but also across the range of environmental, social, and governance factors. And these pages of the report also helpfully call out the synergies between the different EU initiatives. So, for example, EU SFDR requires remuneration disclosures, it requires principal adverse impact disclosures. And these are also themes within EU NFRD. And so the work achieved in the report should help firms in ensuring that the disclosures they prepare under these topics work across a range of different regulatory initiatives and gain synergies in that regard. The final point I wanted to touch on was the ambition of the report in providing readers with a holistic view on how all of a bank's business line activities ultimately feed up into those entity-level disclosures. So firstly, it tracks the business line activities that will need to produce data to feed upstream into the firm-wide disclosures on ESG risks in relation to the business line activities. And that impacts across the banking, capital markets, sales and trading, private banking, and asset management business of the bank. The consequence being that those divisions will need to make client-facing changes to make sure that they're able to track information of the ESG performance of the firm's clients and incentivize those clients to achieve better ESG outcomes. So quite aside from the significant EU regulatory reform agenda in this space is the huge commercial and market demand for ESG products at the moment. And many of those products do not yet sit within formal regulatory frameworks of their own. Nevertheless, the report highlights the imperative for banks and investment firms when launching these products to understand the impact of those business line activities on the overall ESG performance of the banks. And with that, Jacqueline, I'll hand back over to you, and I look forward to the panel's discussion.
Thanks very much, Nikita. Before we start the panel, if I may just ask you a quick question, which is you're having undertaken this work and with your knowledge of the framework and how it interacts and your engagement with your clients in the industry, how do you assess the industry's overall understanding of the current landscape for disclosures?
Yeah, thanks, Jacqueline. It's a really good question. And often when we produce reports like this, or we've seen similar AFME reports in the past, the first question we'll get back after a seminar like this one launching the findings is, these are very detailed findings on where the synergies are, where the implementation steps are. And if I'm a bank or an investment firm and I'm hearing them for the first time, how far behind the curve should I feel? And I think it's fair to say that the industry is a relatively early stage of understanding certainly the synergies between these different pieces of regulation. As has been historically the case, institutions will often, tackle each regulatory reform initiative in a silo, and the focus so far has obviously certainly been on SFDR implementation and low carbon benchmark regulation implementation. And so we're just now at the point, I think, where the industry is starting to look to tie up the loops between these different pieces of regulation and start to identify the synergies as part of their forward-looking project planning, and it can start to close out the gap. And the other point I would make alongside, purely looking at the EU reform agenda is we do spend a lot of time taking a step back and looking at the international landscape on behalf of a lot of the members of the industry who've got offices both inside and outside of Europe. Because ESG is a very macro subject for most institutions. It's difficult to implement it in silos in different jurisdictions. And so in addition to looking at the EU frameworks, we're often looking at progress made elsewhere in other jurisdictions to try and tie those two features up. And then the other point I would just make on that relates to the last point I made, which is the speed with which we're seeing new ESG products come to market, new social bonds, for example, new gender bonds. There's a huge demand for ESG or labeling products with an ESG tenet. And so helping the industry understand what it means to badge something as ESG and trying to align that as far as possible with some of these business line concepts that will ultimately feed up to the entity level disclosure is a key focus area for us at the moment.
Thank you, Nicola. Hopefully we'll hear also from our industry participants on how they are approaching the implementation channels within their firms. I'm sure we will now. Thanks very much. Please join us for the panel. And with that, I'd like to move on to introducing our panelists. So I'm delighted to welcome Alain Deckers from the European Commission. Alain is head of the Corporate Reporting, Audit and Credit Rating Agencies unit at the Commission, and he and his team are the authors of the forthcoming NFRD review proposal. We're also joined by Marie-Pierre Payon. Marie-Pierre is Head of Research and ESG Strategy at Groupama, and she's also the leader of the Financial Institutions Workstream of EFRAG's Project Task Force on Non-Financial Reporting. We're joined also by Pilar Gutierrez. Pilar is a senior policy expert at the EBA, and she leads the EBA's work on Pillar 3 disclosures and transparency for institutions. She's a member of several Basel working groups, including the Basel Working Group on Disclosures, and of the Basel Task Force on Climate Change Risk, where she leads, or co-leads, the disclosure work stream there. We also have from the industry Lucine de la Jonquière, who is a director in Société Générale's Group Public Affairs team, and Lucine focuses on sustainable finance policy and regulation. She's a member of several industry working groups on this topic. And finally, Judson Berkey, who is MD and Group Head of Sustainable Regulation Strategy for UBS, and one of the co-chairs of AFME's Sustainable Finance Steerco. Welcome to all of you. Thanks very much for being here. In terms of how I'd like to structure the panel discussion, I suggest that we start with a bit of scene setting and ask you, especially the official sector guests, to describe the various roles that you and your institutions or your organizations play, what you're working on, and how this all fits together. After that, I'll ask the industry participants to highlight some of the main implementation channels they are facing. We'll then delve into some of the more technical aspects of the disclosure framework and also get into some of the cross-cutting and synergy issues. And then finally, if we have time, and I hope we will, we can discuss a little bit transition finance and the role that disclosures can play in facilitating transition and transition finance. So that's the plan for today. Without further intro from my side, let me kick off and ask Alain if you would mind starting telling us a little bit and just taking a step back and telling us a little bit about the origin of the Commission's NFRD review, the mandate that you've given to EFRAG, and then we would be delighted to hear, if you can tell us, of course, what we might expect from the NFRD review proposals, which, if I understand correctly, are due to come out in the next weeks, if not the next week. So we'd obviously welcome any insights you can give us on what we could expect. Alain, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. You can. Okay. Thank you. Well, good morning. It's a great pleasure to be able to join you on what is a very topical issue, certainly from my point of view and the point of view of my team. We are working very hard, as you have said, Jacqueline, to finalize the NFRD proposal, the review proposal. And as you say, we expect that to come out next week for the Commission to adopt that next week. So a little bit of background. Obviously, you've mentioned the great pace at which work is proceeding in this area, and that is a reflection of the sense of urgency that there is at political level about addressing the sustainability challenge, which I think is a challenge for all of us. There's a broad consensus about that, and in particular in the view itself, included, there is a very strong sense that better disclosures are essential, and the NFRD is a key element of that disclosure framework that we have been developing in the EU for both the financial sector and for non-financial corporates. So you all know the background to the origin of the NFRD. It's actually by now a fairly old directive. If 7 years can be considered old, I guess in dog years it's sorry, I don't hear. Well, I hope you can hear me. And it's been applied since 2000. Decided quite deliberately as part of the first Sustainable Finance Action Plan not to immediately launch into a review of the NFRD because 2018, when we published the first Sustainable Finance Action Plan, was really the first year of application of the directive, and we thought we needed a little bit more perspective before launching into a review of the directive. In the meantime, we've done quite a lot of analytical work. We've done a fitness check for which we intend to publish the results very soon too over the last few years. A lot of other people have done a lot of analytical work, and I think the consensus is that the directive isn't really delivering what it should be delivering, which is to say high quality, comparable information that investors can use in their investment decision making. So that's been the driver for now launching the review of the non-financial reporting directive, and of course with the adoption of other pieces of legislation, including in particular the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, this work has acquired more urgency since there is now a strong sense that better disclosures by investees are a necessary condition to allow the fully successful implementation of the SFDR. So we hope very much that the review of the NFRD will be able to contribute to that and also support the implementation of the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation. Now, I won't go very much into the details of EFRAG's work since Marie-Pierre Payon is going to take care of that. But I will try and put that work into the broader framework of the review of the NFRD. Clearly, one of the key problems that we've identified is the lack of comparability of information. And there's a widespread sense that we're not really going to solve this problem unless we move to the use of common reporting standards. I think this is a conclusion that's been reached not only in Europe, but also at international level. You've seen now also a very considerable pickup in the speed of discussions at international level on reporting and disclosure requirements in this area. So standards are likely to be a very important element, not only in order to ensure comparability, but also because they support possible progress in other areas. Let me give you two examples. First of all, assurance and audit. The NFRD so far pretty much carves out what we still call today non-financial information from any type of audit or assurance requirement. When we hear from investors that this information is now as important or even sometimes more important than financial information for investment decision-making purposes, I think there's a very big question about whether the current situation is tenable. My own view is that it's not tenable. So assurance is something else that we're looking at, and making progress on assurance is of course easier if everybody is working to a common reference, to a common standard, and easier to assure against a more detailed standard than it is against the rather high level and principles-based text that we currently have in the directive. Another one is enforcement. Enforcement is and supervisory convergence in Europe is also a challenge in this area. Again, working to a common standard should help that. Perhaps third point I wanted to mention is digitization. There is a very strong demand for receiving ESG information or sustainability information in digital format now, in machine readable format. Again, the availability of the standard allows you to develop a taxonomy that allows information to be tagged, so that could facilitate also digitization. So these are all areas that we're looking at. You've mentioned the international dimension. We are, of course, working very closely status with
Ella, I think that unfortunately we're losing you. I'm not sure if your connection is stable. Perhaps we could try with you turning off your camera. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the international dimension and your work there. Let's wait for a moment. Otherwise, Ella, I'll come back to ask you the question again. Okay. Ella, I hope you can hear me. We'll come back to you, but in the meantime, perhaps that allows me to move to Marie-Pierre and indeed ask Marie-Pierre if you could please give us an overview of EFRAG's recommendations to the Commission concerning the development of future EU non-financial reporting standards. Marie-Pierre.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much, Jacqueline. First of all, thank you for the invitation, and I'm very happy to. And also, I would like to send you my congratulations for the report. I think it will be a very useful tool for the industry. So I would like to say also that I was very proud to be a member of the PTF. It was a pleasure for me under the leadership of Patrick de Cambourg. And I would like to underline as well that we appreciated the collaboration, the cooperation with the Commission, and especially with DG FISMA, with Alain and his team. So, in few words, the organization of the PTF. The PTF, in few words, we worked on a very short time, in 5 months, from September to February, very short time. There were 35 members from 12 European countries, plus 9 EU public authorities representatives, and plus 18 PMOs. So in total, this represents a full-time equivalent of 30 to 40 people from September to February. So it was a huge work, and now for me, it's a huge challenge to sum up the report in few minutes. So I have to remember as an introduction that the purpose of publicly available sustainability reporting is to provide relevant, faithful, comparable and reliable information. And in this report, you can find 45 proposals to do that. In a few words, the report covers 4 sections. So you have a graph in the report to summarize how the report is organized. The first step, the first section concern the foundation. So we define a robust and current standard setting foundation with 2 principle and with 6 building blocks, including building blocks concerning the FIs, the SMEs, and intangible. And I would like to stop a moment on intangible because I think it's the first report where you can find the relationship between ESG topics and intangible. And as investors, we know that today when we want to evaluate a company, intangible are very, very important. So I wanted to notice in this report. So the second section of the report concern 6 conceptual guidelines. If I sum up very quickly these 6 conceptual, the first one concern the need to align the standard with EU and global sustainability policy priorities, such as the European agenda, and also with the Paris Agreement. The second guidelines concern the definition of what we call high quality information. So we want to put out the relevance, the comparability, the verifiability as well, because we consider that we need to audit all this ESG report. The third guidelines is we need to have retrospective and forward-looking information, and as investors we know what does it mean. The fourth is to define clear boundaries, and the 5 concept guideline is the double materiality concept, which is very important in the EU regulation. And the last one, it's the connectivity we need between sustainability reporting and financial reporting. I think it's a very, very relevant point. The third section it's about the architecture of the future sustainability reporting. So the structure is based of three layers: the sector and agnostic, the sector specific, and the entity specific. After that, we find 3 reporting areas: strategy, implementation, and also performance measurement, which is very important for us. And of course, 3 topics: E, S, and G+, because we had new topics such as innovation in the governance. And the last section, it's a roadmap. And it's the last but not the least, the last part of the report focus on how to build on international initiative and contribute to international conventions. We've taken into account the EU specificities, of course. And the PTF also highlights the need for the EU to be an active player of international cooperation and harmonization. And we are very confident. We want to develop the idea of co-construction at a global level, because it's impossible to build only European standard. We need to participate, and that's why we underline the terms of cooperation.
Marie-Pierre, thank you very much. That makes a lot of sense, and perhaps it allows me to quickly go back to Alain. Pilar, I'll bring you in just a moment, but to ask Alain, to the extent he's able to sort of comment on how the Commission has received EFRAG's advice, and to build a little bit on how this co-cooperation and development of European and international standards might work in practice. So I guess, Alain, if you are there and you can hear us, the question would be, how do you see this developing in terms of international and European standard setting in practice over the coming years? Do we have Alain? We might. Okay, unfortunately, it looks like we've lost him. We'll try and get him back, and we'll come back to the question. Apologies for that. Let me move on. Pilar, the EBA is also doing a lot of work. You're advising the Commission, you're developing ESG Pillar 3 standards. Could you tell us about your work? So specifically, your advice on Article 8 disclosures and how that sits with the broader Pillar 3 ESG disclosure work that you're doing too, how the two components fit together and relate back to the NFRD, perhaps. That would be helpful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jacqueline. And first of all, thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to present our work on ESG disclosure in this event. Indeed, yes, we are doing a lot of policy work on disclosure. We are present in different fora as well in order to ensure this coordination, the need that has been mentioned both by Alan and Marie-Pierre, the need for consistency and coordination across the different initiatives, not only at EU level, but also on international level. There are many initiatives going on, and we agree with the need for coordination. And in particular, we have developed and published recently, on the 1st of March, policy product on ESG disclosures regarding, on the one hand, the disclosure requirements under Article 8 of the Taxonomy Regulation, and on the other hand, the Pillar 3 disclosures that institutions will have to produce both under the Capital Requirement Regulation and under the Investment Fee Regulation. Our work on Pillar 3 is now focused on institutions under the TRR because we have a mandate there. But starting with the Article 8, disclosure requirements. Indeed, on the 1st of March, we published our advice to the Commission on the KPIs that banks and investment firms will have to disclose in order to show to what extent their activities are linked with economic activities that are environmentally sustainable according to the Taxonomy Regulation. We published this advice, including the KPIs, but also the methodology for the calculation of these KPIs, following the call for advice from the Commission. In this call for advice was addressed to the three ISAs, to EBA, ESMA, and EIOPA, and we coordinated our response. And each of us responded regarding the institutions under our jurisdiction, in our case, banks and investment firms. What are we proposing in this advice? The main KPI that we have developed and we are proposing is the green asset ratio. Which applies both to banks, to the banks in their banking book activity, but also to the investment firms in their investment activities, and that would help to show stakeholders to what extent the lending, debt securities, and equity holdings in banks' portfolios or investment firms' portfolios are financing or funding activities from their counterparties that are aligned with the taxonomy, that meet the strict screening criteria in the taxonomy. I will elaborate a bit more later on in the next intervention on the green asset ratio, but I just wanted to say that this is the main KPI that we are proposing. But I mean, we understand that the bank's business models are complex. They are not only doing lending, they have also trading book and other services and assets under management. So we are complementing in our advice, together with the main KPI, which is the green asset ratio, other KPIs in particular for the trading book, which should show to what extent the trading of the bank is linked to instruments that are environmentally sustainable according to the taxonomy regulation. We are proposing also a KPI on fees and commission income coming from servicing other than lending or other than investing in the case of investment firms, which again should show to what extent these services are aligned with the taxonomy. And finally, we are proposing a KPI for some off-balance sheet exposures in the case of banks, in particular guarantees and assets under management. This is regarding the advice to the Commission, but in parallel, we have worked on our consultation paper on Pillar 3 disclosures, prudential disclosures on ESG-related risks by banks and institutions under the Capital Requirement Regulation. We have worked on both products in parallel because on the one hand we had similar timelines and deadlines, but on the other hand to insist on to ensure this consistency, the need for consistency in the information that banks and institutions have to disclose under both frameworks and on definitions. In the Pillar 3 work, we have followed the approach that we usually follow in Pillar 3, and this is developing templates, KPIs and instructions with detailed instructions in order to ensure this consistency and comparability in Pillar 3 disclosures that both Alan and Marie-Pierre mentioned also for other type of disclosures, but after working many years on Pillar 3, both at the Basel level, at the EBA level, I mean, we know the need for this consistency of comparability. So the approach that we have followed in our Pillar 3, which is under consultation and will be under consultation until the 1st of June, is we have proposed templates and instructions for the disclosure of information on risks. We are proposing quantitative templates with data on risks. Here we are following a sequential approach. The scope of the disclosure is very broad. It's environmental, social, and governance, but we are following a sequential approach. And in terms of quantitative data, we are focusing first on climate change, in line also with other initiatives like the taxonomy, which is now focusing on climate change. And here we are proposing templates that will allow institutions to disclose information on those exposures that may be impaired because of climate change transition risk, including information on exposures towards sectors that may highly contribute to climate change, towards fossil fuel companies, and towards other carbon-related sectors, which is in line also with disclosure required, for example, in the TCFD recommendations, and where we have built on classifications and definitions, including in other EU regulations. I think that Nicola mentioned beforehand the link with the low carbon benchmark regulation, because we have indeed built on the proposals included in this regulation for the identification of carbon-related exposures. We are proposing also templates for the disclosure of information regarding real estate assets and their distribution by energy performance of the underlying collaterals, because we understand that the collaterals and the underlying assets may become impaired depending on their energy efficiency rate. But we are also proposing templates on climate change physical risk, including assets of the banks that may be more prone to suffer from acute or chronic physical risk, depending on their geography, their location, the geography, but also on their the sector of activity. In the Pillar 3 disclosures, as we usually do, we are also proposing templates for the disclosure of information on mitigating actions. What banks are doing to mitigate the climate change physical and transition risk. And here we have, there is something that is shared between the advice on their Article 8 and the consultation paper on Pillar 3, which is the green asset ratio. We are proposing again under the Pillar 3 framework the KPIs and templates that we are proposing in the advice for the green asset ratio, because it is a good way to show how institutions are mitigating their risks by finding activities that help counterparties in the transition or in the climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation. But in Pillar 3, we are not restricting the disclosure of information on mitigating action to those actions that are taxonomy aligned, because we understand that banks may be putting in place other actions that also help counterparties in the mitigation process and in the adaptation process, but do not meet the strict screening criteria of the taxonomy. As that's why we are complementing, we are proposing templates not only for the green asset ratio, but for other mitigating actions. And finally, in the Pillar 3 framework, as we usually do, and as mentioned by Nicola beforehand, we are proposing also tables with qualitative information for, in this case, broader scope of environmental, social, and governance risk. Here we are not restricting to climate change, but to the broader scope of environmental, social, and governance that should help institutions to tell their stakeholders what they are doing in order to embed ESG consideration in their governance, in their business model and strategy, and in their risk management framework. And this is all from my side in this overview of the two products, the two main products that we have recently published on ESG disclosures. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Pilar. That's very clear and helps us understand how the Article 8 work and the broader Pillar 3 work that you're doing fit together. Thanks a lot. There's also a tremendous amount there, and I know that, well, I can imagine that the industry participants would like to react and tell you how they see this from their point of view. But before I give the floor to them, I'm glad that Alain has managed to come back, and I just wanted to finish this this round of sort of presentation and setting the scene to finish on the European and international cooperation when it comes to the development of ESG reporting standards. Alain, Marie-Pierre was talking about co-cooperation in EFRAG's advice and recommendations. How has the Commission received that, and how are you working in practice to make European and international standards coincide and develop together? I'm afraid we might have lost him again. Oh, that's really unfortunate. Apologies for that, everybody. Oh yes, we can hear you. Absolutely.
I'm sorry, I'm having terrible connection problems. I've switched off my my camera because it seems to overwhelm my my connection bandwidth.
It's much
so on
thank
the,
you.
I hope you can hear me because I can't hear you anymore. On the international dimension, the approach that EFRAG has set out as co-construction is certainly something that is entirely in line with the way we have always seen the way that we should work between Europe and the international level. If you cast your mind back to, I believe it was early 2019, when Vice President Dombrovskis made the first speech on this topic, we had already said that we needed to achieve two objectives in parallel. The first is ensure that if we use standards, common standards in Europe, that they are consistent with the needs of European legislation. That is essential. We can't have standards under the NFRD that are completely disconnected from the SFDR, from the taxonomy regulation, from all these other pieces of legislation that are in the pipeline, such as sustainable corporate governance, for example. So that's one element. The other element is that we do not want to reinvent the wheel and needlessly fragment capital markets on jurisdictional basis. And therefore, from the very beginning, the Commission made clear that we wanted to work in a spirit of partnership with international standard setters so that we can achieve that convergence and consistency between whatever standards we may use in Europe in the future and standards that exist or that may be developed in the future at international level. So I think the co-construction proposal that came out of the EFRAG task force is entirely in line with that, and we very much welcome it.
Okay, thank you very much. And we're looking forward to see how that will continue to develop in practice. Okay, I'd like to give the floor now to Lucille de la Jonquière from Société Générale to give us a little bit of an overview of what kind of implementation challenges a firm like Société Générale faces for the moment. Lucille, how are you approaching this, and what are your thoughts and reactions on this landscape that the official sector has just set out?
I thank Jacqueline, and good morning, everybody. Actually, we strongly believe that the standardization of sustainability disclosure is definitely an essential step towards the development of a resilient, sustainable finance framework. So everything that is happening now is a very good news. And first of all, just a reaction on Marie-Pierre's comments. I would like to commend the work that the EFRAG task force has been undertaking in the past months. And among other things, we very much appreciated their insistence on the fundamental need for timing and content consistencies between the financial institution sustainability disclosure obligations and those of their corporate clients. And I also welcome what Alain Deckers have just said on the fact that both are communicating vessels, and it is key to address those reporting as such into the future revision of the NFRD. As the AFME and Lassam and Watkins reports underlined, and thanks to Nicola for giving us this very clear overview, we financial institutions are facing a significant and growing amount of sustainability disclosure obligations, and inevitably the need for corresponding data from our corporate clients is accompanying this acceleration. In terms of operational implementations, I'm not going to detail them all again because the other panelists have described them already, but on the taxonomy alignment ratios, what it basically means for us is that we'll have to scrutinize pretty much all our activities and all our clients with the taxonomy lens. As per the approach that is proposed by the EBA, as Pilar described earlier. On the integration of ESG factors into the Pillar 3 requirements, we are assessing that it's pretty much the same in terms of activity scope and in terms of clients covered, but part of it is mainly on carbon-related sectors, whereas on taxonomy regulation is more on the sustainable activities. Implementing those reporting is clearly hard work. And as mentioned several times already in the past few months, we believe that it is mainly conditioned with the availability of the corresponding data from corporate clients. And the problem we're facing today is a clear lack of timing synchronization between the financial institutions reporting obligation and the non-financial institutions reporting obligations. So for very legitimate reason, we are not going to expect corporates to report under the revision of an FRD before 2024. And yet, SFDR, Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, has already entered into force this year, and we are expected to disclose those very detailed level 2 disclosure related aspects as early as next year. Also, with regards to the Pillar 3 related elements, I think it would be very optimistic to expect large corporates to disclose the corresponding data as early as 2024, given the granularity that is required. And I'll come back on that later. But yet, the EBA is proposing that we publish the first reporting as early as Q1 2023. Based on proxies, based on when the data is not available, and definitely it is not. Also, knowingly, and there is a broad consensus on that among corporates, among large corporates, we cannot either expect our clients to publish usable KPIs on their alignment with the taxonomy as early as Q1 2022 based on the 2021 exercise. We have to be realistic. The data will not be usable, and I think they will work mainly on on a best effort basis, at least for the next 2 years. So we'll have to publish at the same time our green asset ratios based on proxies the first year and on real data the second year. But again, we see a mismatch issue, a calendar mismatch issue there. And just one last more for SMEs, for obvious reasons, very legitimate reasons. Not all of them will be captured into the NFRD revision framework. This is not what we expect. And for those that will be captured, it's difficult to imagine them to be able to publish the necessary data for taxonomy-related ratios plus the Pillar 3 ESG disclosure elements very soon. So the rumor has it that not before 2027. So my message today is to say that proxies and estimates seems to be the favorite option. We have this feeling that it is a bit the silver bullet to solve this big mismatch, and we would like more caution on that. We think it would make sense only for the least cases possible. It should not be generalized because all the banks will have different methodologies, will use different data as much as they can, and at the end we'll have not very much comparable data amongst banks, and comparability is key there. So we would ask a bit more time. It's very simple. We just need more time to align calendars and to be able to publish the ratios only when the data is available from an FRD client, and next from an FRD2 clients with regards to the ESG integration on Pillar 3 requirements. And we also forget it in those debates, but time is also needed to prepare our IT systems and our people on top of the time we need to collect the data. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Lucille. That's very clear. And I'll ask Pilar and Marie-Pierre to come in just a moment to hear their thoughts on your points about timing and the use of proxies and whether that does lead to comparable information in practice. But before that, Judson, I'd like to ask you for how UBS approaches this. What are your implementation challenges? What is it like from the point of view of a non-EU headquartered bank dealing with all of the different developments across the world?
Thank you, Jacqueline. Thanks to AFME for organizing this session and the great panelists we have. First, I want to acknowledge what the European colleagues are really trying to achieve here. I think it is admirable, and the breadth of the action plan is impressive. Moving multiple files in parallel is difficult, and obviously responding to the urgency that Alain highlighted is what we need to be doing. And work, the Pilar and her colleagues are trying to link things up, I think, is absolutely the right direction. But it is a big challenge. I mean, we're a big firm coming from a small country. We are a price taker more than anything, so we have to deal with the rules as they come from around the globe and try and knit them together. We are a big believer in transparency and disclosure. We particularly on this sustainability ESG topic. We've been part of the initial groups of things like the Global Compact going back to 2000, PRI, PRB, all of which have transparency disclosure requirements. We were part of the TCFD in its initial formation. We've been publishing a group-wide sustainability report since 2009. That's been based on GRI standards. We absorbed TCFD into that in 2017. We added into that SASB standards 2018-19, and then most recently 2020 reporting, we included the WEF metrics. We really would like to maintain a global approach to our reporting that really covers off our entire group. In a sense, we've been NFRD compliant for UBS as an entire group wide since the beginning. That's been our intent. But I guess what I see ahead is a challenge to that in terms of just the speed and the granularity at which the European framework is developing, which I think Lucille highlighted a fair bit at. And then I guess I'll just try and expand on a little bit more in terms of just putting some numbers around it. Because thanks to Latham, for really putting together this report, it matches what we've been trying to do, which is really layered together what actually is going to be required and how is the flow going to work of all the data across the markets for the combination of taxonomy, SFDR, Pillar 3 ESG, NFRD, 2.0 as it beds down. So the kind of things that we're seeing are, if you take an energy company, say an energy company that has two activities that are taxonomy aligned, it's maybe producing your wind and solar power, and it also has two activities that are taxonomy eligible but not aligned. Say it has some gas and oil powered utility, electricity production still. If you look at the templates that will need to be completed for, revenues, CapEx, OpEx, by our count, there's 121 data points that are going to need to be pulled together for each of those individual templates. Now, that doesn't sound too bad. 363 data points that a corporate needs to pull together. They're starting next year for first taxonomy Article 8 disclosure. But we're on the receiving end of those 363 data points. And if you look at our requirements across the Article 8 KPIs as well as your Pillar 3 ESG, if we were basically lending to that large company, also doing a bit of market making, for some of its financial instruments, and maybe also doing a bit of corporate advisory. Again, I'm not sure we have this exactly figured out yet, but we came to 236 data points that we would need to be able to disclose. But the challenge for us is we don't just have one counterparty we're absorbing 363 from to turn into 236. In our Swiss business alone, we have 100,000 counterparties. So even if, say 10% of them, we are doing that full suite of financial sector activities, then you're up to almost 2.5 million data points that we need to be able to create. And given the timing around the Pillar 3 or the Article 8 the taxonomy disclosures, that's basically the 2021 reporting cycle in early 2022. So we have 9 months to get this together, which we've already missed last year's IT budgeting cycle. And so it's a challenge ahead. It's certainly not impossible. I don't want to say, it's impossible, but just the lift that's going to be required going forward. So I think anything that can be done to kind of, some sense, stage things, you pace things, you line up some of the timelines from our perspective would be highly desirable, or else I think we may have to start sort of, fragmenting some of our reporting and move away from that global standard, just because we won't be able to meet the requirements and the timelines being asked for. Now, it's not to say, we don't think, directionally correct. I think absolutely, we think more information, high quality information is needed in the market, but it should be information. It's easy to generate lots of data. What we're interested in is high quality information. Reporting is never just reporting. Reporting and disclosure done well really takes the whole process behind. And it's about generating high quality information that is decision useful into the market by reporting. So in some cases, less can be more in the first instance, and modular approaches can be very, very beneficial.
Thanks, Judson. And I think the points you are making are consistent with one of the questions that we've had from the audience, which is, can there be some more phasing, some more time, etc.? I think Lucille also was clear. She said time. And then there's also the issue of proxies in the interim. But if I could ask maybe Pilar or Alain, who I think is still online with us, even if we don't have him on camera, but Pilar and Alain, what are your reactions and comments when it comes to the possibility to give more time, to allow more phase-in? Pilar.
Okay, Jacqueline, if you want, I can start. Well, at the EBA, we are very aware of the challenges that the banks are facing to produce this data. And well, we have proposed, in our response to the Commission and FRD consultation, but also in our advice, some policy recommendations to the Commission on how to facilitate accessibility of data by extending the scope of the NFRD, but making publicly available information that is already there, like information on energy performance certificate labels, on CO2 emissions, which is there because there are organizations in the US and the EU that have this information. So we are proposing some policy recommendations that should facilitate the availability of data. Well, there are, in the case of banks, there is also a bilateral relationship of banks with their customers, because banks need not only to disclose this information, but to manage their risks. So, and they cannot wait to manage the risk. So the bilateral, as included in our loan origination and management guidelines, is very important. A source should be a very important source of information. There, we already mentioned the need of this bilateral contact with counterparties to start collecting this data. We are still aware of the challenges of this data, but there are, as soon as 2030, already quite ambitious objectives in terms of climate change and other environmental and social aspects. So at the same time, we know that it's challenging, but at the same time, I think that we are already late on this providing this information, both to manage risk and also to inform stakeholders. I think that in other cases, disclosure comes when everything is crystal clear. In this case, we think it's important that to push for the disclosure. On the one hand, so that banks start collecting information that they need for their own risk management, but also to inform stakeholders and to push for this, the need for reorienting capital flows to meet the objectives, which are quite ambitious, of the environmental agenda, right? Anyway, but what we do at DBA is, both in the case of the advice to the Commission and in the Pillar 3 disclosure, is applying the mandates. So the deadlines for the disclosure are not set in our products, but in the level 1 text, in the case of the taxonomy regulation in Article 8, in the case of the CRR in Article 449A, and the application dates are there. So what we do is we comply with our mandate. But we understand that there are challenges. We understand that these disclosures would be not like other disclosures where everything is crystal clear. Although even if everything is crystal clear, we are aware that first reportings are not so accurate as when the reportings have been going on from some time. And while we understand the challenges in terms of data, we are proposing some recommendation both to banks and to the Commission on how to address the challenges. And we are aware also that on the one hand it's too soon because of the availability of data, but it's too late because of the objectives if we want to indeed become a sustainable economy.
Absolutely, no, that's well understood, and it's about how to square this circle exactly. Alain, Pilar was referring to the fact that timelines are set out in level 1 mandates given to EBA. What are the Commission's views on timing and sequencing and the possibility of phasing things in more progressively, perhaps?
Well, I think the overall the overall approach to the timing is, of course, driven by this sense of urgency. And that is what you hear when you speak to politicians, who are the ones who make decisions about this. There is a great deal of urgency to address the sustainability challenge, and therefore there is limited time to simply hang around and develop things in a fully worked out way. So we are going to be, this is, in my view, going to be to a certain extent an iterative process. We are going to learn as we go along. I doubt very much that data and reports will be perfect in the first year that they are required. There is always a learning curve when you deal with reporting. I mean, when a new IFRS standard comes out, there's also a learning curve. Generally, the data gets better over 2-3 years. ISB then does a post-implementation review, then it tries to improve things to see if anything's gone wrong. So that is inevitably going to be part of the process. Now, what can we do to try and make things as smooth as possible? First, I think in the standard setting process, I'm thinking now from the point of view of the NFRD review. If we put forward a proposal that requires the development of standards, I think we, as part of the standard setting process, we need to make sure that all the interfaces between these different reporting processes are properly considered in the standard setting process. That's number one. Secondly, there are a number of flanking measures or accompanying measures, call them what you will, that I think we can implement to help things along. Now, these by themselves will not materialize from one day to the next. They will also take a little bit of time, but in the fullness of time, we hope they will help. First of all, as I've said before, we are trying in our work on the revision of the Non-Financial Reporting Directive to think in a fully digital way. We need to move reporting into a fully digital world. It simply does not make sense in 2021 to still work with these traditional paper or even PDF reports. Now, some people say machine learning is going to allow us, or natural language processing is going to allow us to deal with all this stuff. I'm very skeptical. I think we need to use a lot more, move a lot more towards using structured data standards, which will then ensure that data flows much more smoothly through the value chain. You avoid all kinds of extraneous costs, errors that are introduced because of rekeying requirements and so on. So that's one thing I think that we need to think about very carefully. The other is it's all very good requiring banks and all kinds of companies to report all kinds of information, but if the users of that information then can't actually get hold of it or find it, then we have a problem. And that's something that we're working on. We're trying to, as part of the Capital Markets Union, we're developing something called the European Single Access Point. Again, that won't materialize from one day to the next, but our objective is to make sure that all relevant information can be accessed in a seamless manner, so that, for example, when you're trying to aggregate data from an investment portfolio or from your lending portfolio for a bank, that there is an easy way to get hold of that data. If you combine that with the digitization, hopefully that can help the process along. So those are some of the things that I think we can do. If you ask me about the fundamental question of timing and urgency, I think that is fundamentally a political issue that is way beyond my pay scale.
Understood. Thank you very much. And all of those flanking or accompanying measures that you've been describing, AFME is very supportive of them, indeed. I wanted to ask Marie-Pierre for her views, sort of, as a contributor to perhaps future standard setting in Europe, what your views are on the use of proxies also, at least for an interim phase, and how much that helps or hinders comparability, and if it's the only solution, and what can be done perhaps to facilitate that process, what would be needed for proxies to be really helpful. Marie-Pierre, any thoughts?
Very difficult to answer to your question. It could be the beginning of the solution, but it can't be the whole solution, because we, as investors, we need to have a look on the methodology of the proxies, and so it can be the beginning of the solution, but it's not the whole solution.
Okay, thank you very much. Marie-Pierre, while you have the floor, could I ask you to give us a little bit more specific information on the work stream that you led for EFRAG with respect to financial institutions? What were your recommendations to the Commission there? I mean, I'm sure that we've already heard, actually, in the context of our discussion, some of the key points, but to the extent that things aren't covered, what would you like to bring out? Has anything been missed in what we've been discussing so far?
Well, just to sum up, as you know, in the EFRAG, the task force, there were a specific stream about the FIs. It was the A5. And in this group, this working group, there were 6 stream members coming from the banking industry, insurance companies, and asset management industry, plus the 3 ESAs, and Pilar was a member, and she was very helpful for us, and plus the ECB as well. And we found in the report 2 proposals concerning the FIs. And as I told at the beginning, it's in the building blocks number 3. And maybe I can give you, and you can find different elements that we talk about this morning in these 2 proposals. And I would like to sum up very quickly the 2 proposals. The first proposal is concerned the specific role and needs of financial institutions, both as users and preparers. Because the first element that we wanted to point out in our report is that the fact the indirect impacts are much more important for industry, for finance, for banks, for asset managers, for insurance companies than direct impact. So our stream were focused on indirect impacts. So it's the first point. And after that, we have identified 4 characteristics that the future standard setter have to keep in mind when he is going to write the future standard. The first one is that the financial institution are not an homogeneous group. You have different categories, and we distinguish 3 categories: banks, insurance, and asset management. The second characteristic is that the financial sector is very heavily regulated. And in our assessment report, you can find a matrix about that. But I think the report that Nicolas showed us at the beginning show the importance of regulation for the finance sector. So the first characteristic is the lack of coordination and harmonization among the EU regulation. And we already talk about that, so we have the same constant. And the fourth challenge for financial institutions are the fact we are global players. So we finance and we invest in global clients, and all these clients have different level of reporting. So the future standard setter have to take in mind that we are global. And this is the first recommendation, the recommendation. And I think there's a lot of convergence with we report and we talk about part of it. The second proposal wanted to define key elements to answer to the needs of financial institution. So to be very short, we have to have an access to a limited set of material, comparable, and reliable KPIs. What we want to underline that it's not necessary to have that client publish a lot of information. Today we notice that there is inflation in information. It's not always necessary for us. We need to limit the KPIs, but we want to have a very comparable and reliable KPIs. That is the first point. The second point, the second point we need, is and Lucille talked about that a minute ago. The data quality needs to be timely and easily accessible, and because we are dependent on the data that our clients publish, and so we need time, and we make two recommendations And the third element is that we need to cover all sustainable topics, not only climate topics, because very often it's much more focused on climate change. And today, with the COVID crisis, we saw that we need a social information as well. And the other point is we point out to the need to have retrospective information, but also forward-looking information, and especially for climate, if we want to put in place the right investment decision. And the last point is that we need three categories of information: qualitative information, of course, quantitative information, but not only quantitative in physical terms. We also need to have more and more monetary information. And I remember we had an interesting debate with Alain during the last plenary session with the FRAG, because the financial institution wanted to point out that it's absolutely necessary to have this monetary information if we want to integrate this information in our decision making. We need to evaluate the impact, because our clients ask us not only for financial performance today, but they ask us also for environment and social performance. And so that's why we need few monetary information, but we know that the methodology are not very well developed today, but we know that it will take time, but we have to take in mind this element.
Thanks, Marie-Pierre. I'd like to ask Judson a question about how he and his firm view the use of proxies also in the meantime, and what could be done to ensure their quality. Is regulation required there? Is there another flanking measure that can be envisaged?
Yeah, no, I appreciate the vision that Elaine outlined. I think that's great, but it will take some time to get to that point that the data is all around and accessible and easy to get to. So in the interim, yeah, there will be proxies, and I think there will be a big role for the ESG data providers. I think these regulations make a good market for them for the next few years. If you look at SFDR, for example, if you start to calculate that one through, you have basically 24 data points for any Article 8 or Article 9 fund. 100 equities in an average fund. Some firms pushing up to 500 Article 8 and Article 9 products already. Then you're talking 1 million data points to pull together. So you got a bank that needs to pull together 2 million by next year, and an asset manager needs to pull together 1 million. So we're not going to be doing this on our own, clearly. We're going to be leveraging the utilities, and so the ESG data providers will be a key role in the ecosystem. So does it need to be some focus on them? Yes, yeah, I think so. But I think Marie made a good point, and it's not just about you're generating lots of data and information. And I think Pilar also had it right. This should be about managing risks, and I think there are ways to put forward disclosures and reporting that that can drive the right behaviors. And to Elaine's point, we don't have time to to wait on some of this stuff. But if you look at, I guess, our own example with with UBS and our TCFD reporting, a couple of years ago we started reporting on our first our carbon intense sector, so as prescribed by TCFD. So basically, you have pure exposure numbers for our lending to energy and utilities. Now, for us, that's a rather small number, less than 2% of our balance sheet. So that's an interesting data point right there in terms of size of the problem. Then a couple of years ago, we started reporting on what we call climate sensitive sectors. So those that are more exposed to transition risk and potentially physical risk down the line. That's a bigger number. It's around close to 40 billion of our 240 billion balance sheet, so around 13%. That's interesting as well. I mean, in terms of, okay, that's not something you could absorb an immediate capital hit on, clearly, whereas a couple billion you could. So you start to size the problem a bit more. This past year in our TCFD disclosures, we took those 38 billion of lending and we broke that down into 5 buckets, sort of a low to high kind of rating to give additional granularity on what those lending exposures really are. So if you look at our high bucket from our last year's TCFD disclosure, you see 22 million of thermal coal lending, 39 million of shale gas, and 21 million of oil refining. And just that simple transparency there is enough to spark quite an interesting conversation. I've witnessed some rather good and heated conversations internally about what is that exposure? Where is it? Which country is that supporting? What are their net zero commitments? Who are the counterparties? What's their transition plan? Have they made net zero commitments? What are the risks and opportunities for us being associated with that lending? I think that simple level of disclosure can actually drive a lot of the conversations we really want to be happening in the finance sector and the economy more broadly. I'm not sure we need millions of data points. So I guess back to your question to Elaine, what can we do to recognize the constraints? I think there's something to think about in terms of scoping the requirements to the current capabilities with a focus on what really is going to drive decision useful reporting and information, and not necessarily trying to get after every data point that we possibly could. That's not a statement about delay. Don't push things forward. Absolutely, I agree with the need to push. But if we're going to be pushing so hard, we need to make sure we focus. We concentrate on the things that are really going to drive the right behaviors and decision useful information. This is not like a new accounting standard. This is not even, say, OTC derivatives, which I was part of back in the early 2010s. A lot of this information we don't even have. The companies don't even have. So we can't even disclose it. And proxies, I'm not convinced really drive decision useful information because they're averages that aren't specific to the actual exposure you have. So to have a discussion about transitions, it's not just a spreadsheet conversation. It's a conversation. What is that company's strategy? What's their business plan? What are their risks and opportunities? What financing do they need? How can we help them be successful and be part of the transition? That's what we really want to focus on, not generating lots of numbers.
Thanks, Judson. I think that's very clear. Less is more, but less doesn't mean avoiding objectives, and less can help to contribute to meaningful conversations and decisions. I can see Nicola nodding and unmuting herself. Nicola, would you like to come in?
Yeah, I just thought there was one other lens that I might offer to the discussion on the use of proxies and the ability to get credible data to back up the disclosures. And of course, we as lawyers look at disclosure risk quite frequently, and just from the trends in our own ESG task force, which comprises of lots of different specialties around the firm, I would say the one area that is moving as quickly as EU regulation in terms of challenging the sector is ESG litigation and the litigation risks that banks and investment firms make where they do trip up in their disclosures because that they don't have the data to back them up, or perhaps they've used a proxy and there's some sort of wrinkle in the proxy that means that the end disclosure ends up not being entirely accurate. So that speed and rise of litigation risk in the ESG space is certainly notable for banks, I think, when they're thinking about how to meet these requirements. And of course, not just coming from traditional litigation sources, but also the climate lobbying groups are incredibly active, both facing the regulators and facing banks, both feeling the pressure of those groups to drive the agenda forward. And noting the comments around, it's a political decision on timing and not anything that anybody on this panel really has the mandate to change. I think it does go a long way in terms of protecting industry from some of those risks where regulators are vocal about the challenges of transition and the fact that there may be gaps in the data in terms of the disclosure standard. The more that's communicated as being the understood threshold, I think that can go some way in protecting the firms making those disclosures from some of those threats. And so, we've certainly seen the authorities sitting on the panel today be really helpful in that regard when they're presenting papers understanding the transition risk. And I think we should continue to perpetuate that message for a period of time.
Thanks, Nicola. I think, yes, that would be a very helpful sort of accompaniment to all public sector communications for the moment. Thanks. We are fast running out of time and we have 5 minutes left. I would quickly like to tackle some of the audience questions, and perhaps particularly those in relation to the GAR, to the Green Asset Ratio. Pilar, you did give us a description of what the EBA is proposing there, but perhaps you could quickly reiterate why and how you've chosen some choices when it comes to geographical scope, but also certain choices when it comes to covering different kinds of banking activities, the lending book, the trading book, other types of services, and whether there would be, given what we've been discussing now about sort of the complexity and perhaps information overload, whether there would be an area that could be focused on and privileged, at least in terms of sequencing.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Indeed. So yes, the green asset ratio, first of all, we are focusing in the banking book because we thought that the aim of the business, this ratio is to show how banks are financing activities that are enabling, transitioning, or contributing to the objectives, environmental objectives included in the taxonomy regulation. So this is why we are focusing the green asset ratio on the banking book compared to the trading book, where we know there are short-term investments, much more variable. And for this part, we are proposing a separate KPI, which would show how banks are contributing to the trading of this type of instrument rather to funding this kind of activities. So this is the main reason. The term of the investment is longer term compared to shorter term, and also the objective. In one case, we want banks to show if they are funding taxonomy aligned activities. In the other case, if they are trading with taxonomy aligned activities. On the geographical scope, we are limiting the green asset ratio at the beginning to, we understand that there is a challenge in terms of data. The challenge in terms of data is greater for exposures outside the EU. That's why at the beginning we are proposing an EU green asset ratio focus on the EU activities. We understand that there are banks with a lot of activities outside the EU, so we are not asking them to include these exposures in the green asset ratio, but to show on a best effort basis also some information for the non-EU exposures. We think it's difficult to ask them to include this, the information on non-EU exposure in the green asset ratio, but at the same time we think that they should start disclosing separately some information for non-EU exposures. And on the data availability and the sequencing, because there are more challenges, we are already proposing this sequencing. The green asset ratio is focused on at the beginning on NFRD corporates, those corporates that those counterparties that will have to disclose information under Article 8 of the taxonomy regulation, which will help banks to prepare their own green asset ratio. And we are proposing a transition period until June 2024 for banks to extend the ratio to SMEs or other non-FRD corporates, or even to the retail real estate portfolio, because we understand that there are more challenges. Here we are proposing that in between they can start disclosing information in terms of proxies and ranges. And here whenever banks are using proxies, they should make it clear to avoid this kind of risks that Nicola was mentioning. We are aware of the challenges, on the other hand, we are aware of the urgency. So banks, when disclosing information, they have to explain also how they are preparing this information and to what extent they are using proxies because of data availability issues. So I think that this is something that they should explain clearly so that stakeholders are aware of the challenges that banks are facing to retrieve this data, but at the same time, are aware of the bank's strategy, how they are embedding their consideration, ESG consideration into their business models and governance. And of course, I think that is something that Judson mentioned. You mentioned, Judson, the bilateral relation with the clients. You have to sit with your counterparties to check their strategy. This is one of the things that we are proposing. So the bilateral liaising, not only rely on public disclosures, but sit with your counterparties to understand what they are doing and how that impact in your risk asset ratio, in your risk management, and eventually in your disclosures.
Thanks, Pilar. We're at an end of our time, and I would have loved to bring back Lucille and others, but I'm afraid that we are out of time and I will have to close. AFME will be responding to the Pillar 3 disclosure consultation. We're looking very much forward to seeing the forthcoming NFRD proposals. I think one conclusion that I take away from what you all said is that less can be more. It doesn't mean that we're not doing things. It means it can provide some focus and guidance for appropriate decision making. But with that, I'd like to thank all of the panelists, L&W for their hard work on the report, my AFME colleagues for organizing this event, and especially Tanya, who leads the sustainable finance work for AFME and has really been a driving force behind this report, but also all of our other work. The report itself is available on AFME's website, afme.eu, and I know that was one of the audience questions too about where to find the proposed templates for Pillar 3 disclosures. They are on the EBA's website too. And with that, massive thanks again to all of you, and thank you to the audience for listening to us. Have a lovely day. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, and bye.
Bye.